have another fantastic panel. Shifting to a different, slightly different focus now, focusing in specifically on male suicide prevention in rural communities. We've called this session Strong, Stoic and Silent, ? Does suicide prevention work for rural blokes? The speakers we've got in the following order are John Patterson, who we're going to see and hear from in just a moment, Owen Connolly of the Latrobe Regional Hospital, John Clark from rural Alive and Well Tasmania. We've got Victoria. I haven't got the full name there. I've got two people.
Sorry, it's Lauren Dunkley.
Right, okay. There's no. We'll take away Victoria for you. I apologise for that.
Thank you. A nice name, but no.
It's a lovely name. Couldn't work out whether we've got the region of the country or what we've done there. But anyway, eminently professional, as you can see, Lauren Dunkley and Claire Gander from the RAMHP Communications project, with talking about you got this, mate. You got this, mate. Excellent.
Yes.
Great. So first, I'm going to give the floor to John Patterson. He's listed as being with the Freemasons Victoria Suicide Prevention Project, but I'm sure he'll tell you he does more than that. Besides, I had the absolute pleasure of having John come along to an event I ran in Victoria maybe about 3 years ago now, John, I think. And he shared a bit of poetry for us as a way to get into a conversation that day. And I've asked John if he'd possibly come back and tell us about that poem he's been sharing with blokes in rural communities and how that helps open up conversation. So John, the floor's yours for a good 10 minutes, my friend. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being part of this as well. I think it's a very important area that's gaining more leverage, thank God, as time goes on. I got involved in this about 4 or 5 years ago when Freemasons Victoria actually asked me to do something at Queen's Hall, Parliament House. And as a result of that, we've been going around the state and interstate trying to get what we call starting the conversation. I found it very difficult initially to actually sit down and sort of say to a guy or a girl, how are you going? Sometimes they would say, yeah, that we're struggling a bit. Most of the time they wouldn't tell you at all. Until I started reciting poetry. And it's amazing how often people, I think, firstly are mesmerized by the fact that you can recite. And secondly, they find a message somewhere in them for themselves. And there's 2 poems that I use. One's a poem called Rain from Nowhere by Murray Hutton. And the other one is called If by Rudyard Kipling. Both poems in certain areas have a great effect. With suicide rates now, the latest figures that I've seen is 8.3, it's probably up around about 10, I would imagine, when we take in other factors like car sort of crashes that aren't put into the suicide rates. It's something that I think that we've actually got to push harder and harder. Interesting to hear about COVID and how farmers come together or go away, droughts and floods. I'm a farmer, by the way. We all have our various ways of coping with those mechanisms. I think with droughts and floods and fires, our minds are actually pushed to other areas whilst those are in progress. It's after that the problems happen. Rain from Nowhere was penned after a drought, actually, and it's very powerful, and it does actually start the conversation. It's by Murray Hutton. His cattle didn't get a bid. They were fairly bloody poor. What was he going to do? He couldn't feed them anymore. The dams were all but dry. Hay was $13 a bale. Last month's talk of rain was just a fairy tale. His credit had run out. No chance to pay what's owed. Dark thoughts ran through his head as he drove down Gully Road. Geez, great-granddad bought the place back in 1898. Now I'm such a useless bastard. I'll have to shut the gate. Can't support my wife and kids. Not like Dad and those before. Crikey, Grandma kept it going while Pop fought in the war. With depression now his master, he abandoned all that's right. There's no place in life for failures. He'd end it all tonight. There were still some things to do. He'd have to shoot the cattle first. Of all the jobs he'd ever done, that would be the worst. He'd have a shower, watch the news, then they'd all sit down for tea, read his kids a bedtime story, watch some more TV, kiss his wife goodnight, say he was off to shoot some roos. Then in a paddock, far away, he'd blow away the blues. But he drove in the gate and stopped, as he always had, to check the roadside mailbox, and found a letter from his dad. Now his dad was not a writer. His mum did all the cards and mail. But he knew the writing from notebooks he'd kept from cattle sales. He sensed the nature of its contents, felt moisture in his eyes. Just the fact his dad had written was enough to make him cry. Son, I know it's bloody tough, this cruel and twisted game, this life upon the land when you're screaming out for rain. There's no candle in the darkness, not a single speck of light. But don't let the demon get you. You've got to do what's right. I don't know what's in your head, but put the dark thoughts well away. See, you've always got your family at the back end of the day. You have to talk to someone. And yes, I know I really did, but you have to think about Fiona. And think about the kids. I'm worried about you, son. You haven't called for quite a while. I know the road you're on because I've walked every bloody mile. The date, December 7, back in 1983, behind the shed. I had a shotgun, rested in the brigalow tree. See, I borrowed way too much to buy the Johnson place. And then it didn't rain for years and we got bombed by interest rates. The bank was at the door. I didn't think I had a choice. I began to squeeze the trigger. That's when I heard your voice. You said, "Where are you, Daddy? It's time to play our game. I've got the squatter all set up. We might get General Rain." It really was that close. You're the one that stopped me, son. You're the one that taught me there's no answer in a gun. Just remember, people love you. Good friends won't let you down. Look, you might have to swallow pride and take that job in town just till things come good, son. You've always got a choice. And when you get this letter, ring me, because I'd love to hear your voice. Well, he cried and laughed and shook his head and put the truck in gear, closed his eyes and hugged his dad in a vision that was clear, dropped the cattle at the yards, put the truck away, filled the trobs as best he could, then fed his last 10 bales of hay. Then he strode towards the homestead, shoulders back and head held high. He still knew the road was tough, but there was purpose in his eyes. He called his wife and children who'd lived through all his pain. Hugs said more than words. He'd come back to them again. They talked of silver linings, how good times always follows bad. And then he walked towards the phone, picked it up and rang his dad. And while the kids set up the squatter, he hugged his wife again. And then they heard the roll of thunder and they smelt the smell of rain. I've recited that poem from Sydney to Perth in all situations, from corporate boardrooms to farming groups. It never, ever fails that someone always comes up and can identify something in that poem and actually start the conversation. So my job then becomes very easy. You can actually point them in the right direction. I don't try and do anything about solving their problem, but certainly you can give them a phone number or you can get someone to call them. And that, I think, in my experience, and I'm just a humble farmer, as I say, has been a very good example of one way of starting the conversation.
John,
Any question?
why did you come and make us cry?
Say that again.
Why did you come and make us cry, John?
That's actually a common thing. But I think, look, at the end of the day, it's the reality of where this is. And I think that's why the conversation is so hard, because suicide and people talking about suicide is difficult as it is. And I think the great thing about that bit of prose is it gives both sides of the equation. It shows him going into that depth, that pit. It also shows him coming out. Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of it. Yes, it's a bit of a tearjerker, but by the same token, it does put a smile on your face when you see that he's come out of the other side of the equation.
Yeah. And we've heard quite rightly a lot already today, as we always do in conversations about men, about, you know, the difficulty of men talking and getting help. But I'm sure you find that when you create the right environment, blokes will come and talk to you and tell you their story. And I imagine that you get loads of experience of blokes just you've never met before coming up and sharing their story because you've opened the door to that, right?
Oh, that's definitely the case. And in fact, I had just last Wednesday night, I had a guy who I've never met just rang me because he'd heard me talk somewhere and just thought that he wanted to talk about that poem initially, but it turned out that he was having tremendous mental problems. And the great thing about that is, since then, he's seen someone and actually is on the way up. So he's actually rung me back to say, thank you, I've been able to do something about it. The sad part about it is that when I started this program some 4 or 5 years ago, it was nearly 20 something years to the day that my own brother shot himself. So it's those that are left behind, those that take a time to adjust themselves, getting over the hurt of why didn't I do something? And they're all the things that I've been through, that hopefully out of doing this, you may actually save somebody else. Now, we don't know whether we do, but I'm sure we do help them along the way. And I'm pretty satisfied that the numbers are coming out that you've only got to help one and it's been successful. If you do 2 or more, well, you're starting to have a real benefit.
Yeah. John, I just want to acknowledge, I'm so sorry to hear about your brother. Like so many people in this space, part of the reason we do this is because of our own experience, whether that's our own struggle or having family members and friends that we've lost. And it's absolute testament to you, sir, that you do what you do and make a difference for others. It's an extraordinary gift that you have.
Thank you.
Thanks for starting those conversations with the blokes in your community. So, what do we call this title? Something about strong, stoic, and silent. I think maybe John, in a very articulate way, has actually challenged that question mark. Thanks for starting the conversation in that way, John. I think it's a really good place to start this conversation from a place of emotion. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. I'm sure if we were allowed to clap here, there'd be a big round of applause, but there's lots of virtual hand claps going up around the room. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to you in the panel discussion to get some further thoughts and reflections from you. So I'm going to shift in pace slightly now as we come to our second speaker. Also from Victoria. I think actually, Owen, we had you and John at the same event about 3 years ago. Owen is one of those, another one of those people that when you go into a certain area and you start talking about suicide prevention and men, he's one of those people who's obviously in the game because his name gets mentioned by several people. I think Owen brings a unique perspective because he's speaking from within the system. He's a mental health nurse in the Latrobe region, but he's got a really good mind and a good oversight of how the kind of the strategic frameworks that we have to work with and the tools that we have to work with shape our ability to work effectively with men. I always enjoy my conversations with Owen and learn lots from him every time we speak. He has insights that other people don't tend to bring, and I hope I'm not setting you up for a fall here, Owen, but I expect that he will provide some stuff to the table that you maybe haven't thought of before. So Owen, over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Glenn. Right, you haven't set me up for too much there, and certainly following on from John, he's pretty well described our day-to-day activities and what we're all trying to achieve. I guess we're all here because we're all somewhat the letterboxes that was described in the poems. The area that I work in is in Gippsland in Victoria. So we covered from Malakuta, which got pretty hard at the start of the year, through to Phillip Island, and then up into the hills down to Wilson's Prom. So it's a pretty decent sized area. A real good mix of rural and sort of remote. We have a number of bush nurses and GPs, and so a real kind of spread of different kind of services across the area. So my involvement with suicide prevention in this area and a little bit more across Victoria has been primarily around setting up a couple of services over the last 5 or 6 years, and looking at who we actually see within that. And we've been kind of, haven't done too bad. We've seen about 82% male, which is kind of similar to what our male-female suicide rates are in this region. So we're doing something that seems to be catching men and holding on to them. That said, we're very small, and we're looking at trying to engage more broadly than that. So there's certainly not enough people around that do what we do, but we're taking a very broad approach across the region, and that we will connect in wherever we can connect in. We don't connect in with a particularly clinical kind of way of operating. Whilst we have the clinical expertise, as a nurse practitioner, I can prescribe. I'm probably the biggest letdown in the land. I don't prescribe much at all. But what we do look at is a lot of what are the drivers around that are leading a person to feel suicidal. And we try and tackle and try and support people to work through those. And for men, it's a little bit different in that it's been said often that men will stop and talk if you put them in the right framework. But one thing that we've found is that by actually plotting out what that looks like or what we actually do and having some structure around how we work with men has been really important. So for example, a lot of men on farms were going into town to do a number of jobs, and they'll have a list. So they know what they're going to a particular place to do. Frequently when we're talking about counselling or suicide prevention or other things, it's not really clear. People go in, they expose their deeper soul, and then come out feeling worse than they went in. And that's just really, really not the way that we want to work it. So one of the things that we make a point of is really mapping out the journey for the person. So they know if they're coming to see us, we're going to do certain things, so they can tick it off the list. And it actually occurred to me through COVID that when I had to talk to my GP, that that was actually quite good. And that if, as a guy, that if I was then asked to go and see him and I had a shopping list of what I was going to be doing there, I'd actually probably go and see him. So I wonder if that's one of the things that we can pull out of COVID around how we engage people within health services. So what we tend to do across Gippsland is not only just work within the clinical mental health services, but also the more broader areas. We don't have enough support workers or counsellors in our more rural areas. So we try to be as adaptive as we can and look at the workers in the area as being specialist generalists, and look at trying to not only support them directly, but also boost what's the knowledge and the understanding and the pathways right across the area. One thing we find really, really useful is either going to where men want us to go to. So not only do we go and lean over a fence if they want us to lean over a fence, if they just want to come and see us when they're in town, then they can come and see us within town. They've got a clear idea of why they're going. So we try not to set it up so that it's a real hard and rigid way of operating. If somebody can make a phone work or make a video conference work, we'll do that. But if people just want to stop and talk, then we'll just do that and go for a walk. I spent a couple of weeks in Malakuta at the end of January, a lot of it with the Army and the Air Force and every other man and his dog up there. But it was really interesting just touching base with some of the locals as an older guy. And it was great. There was no problems with conversations, and you know, guys do it very difficult in those areas. So we've had some pretty interesting times in Gippsland. We've had the fires in 2009. We learned a bit, well, we had them all through the early 2000s. Then 2009, we've had droughts. We had locusts did a bit of a run through here at one stage. We got floods. We get, you know, the plague, pestilence, fire and flood. We've had the lot, and we keep getting the lot. So the bunch that we have here in this area are strong, stoic and silent, but when they need to be, which is exactly, so for me, it comes across as a bit of a negative, but I don't see it that way. That strength is something that we try and tap into and work really closely with. I haven't got a timer on, so I'm not quite sure where Glenn's got me at, but I'm quite happy to keep going or slow down.
Yeah, no, keep going.
Yeah, we've found we're actually working on at the moment, and I think one of my colleagues, Rita's listening in at the moment, on working at a more regional plan around how we deal with or how we work with suicide right across the board at all the different levels, and what we need to do at each of those across the region. And I think that's the way we need to look at it. It's not just about a clinical service who work predominantly with people whose drivers around suicidality are the more significant and heavy duty mental health problems. But most people, the problems are around the crap of life, essentially. And so what we want to try and do is just through caring and just through engaging people is just, regardless of where they are, just try and support people as much as possible. A couple of other things that we've kind of noticed on this journey is that when people talk about suicide, we really have to drill down as to what do they actually mean. And a lot of the time, we have to differentiate between somebody using the word suicide as a way of describing their distress, as opposed to a statement of intent. And the two things are really important when we do talk to people, is actually just understanding what that difference is, because we react quite differently. Certainly if it's a statement of intent, we need to make sure we give someone some extra time and keep them a bit safer. But if it's around distress, it's more around talking about, or having that person having the opportunity to vent and let go and work through those things. So we're quite lucky in Gippsland. We've got a couple of place-based trials going. There's been a lot of funding pushed into East Gippsland and Far East Gippsland around trying to get the service level up to just normal. But on top of that, we've also got some funding around a HOPE program, which is very similar to the ATAP suicide prevention service that we used to have, and some may be familiar with that. And what that's around is about being able to work with someone for 3 months who doesn't necessarily have a mental health problem or a diagnosis, and being able to support them through that period of recovery. If we need to repeat it, we do it, etc., etc. In turn, we've also in the process of contracting a provider for the Way Back support service, which is a Beyond Blue psychosocial support service. So we're really happy with that, and that we can actually spread our reach across the region a heck of a lot more than what we've had in the past. But we've had enough time to be able to do some road testing and figure out what works and get the connections. So when we actually we can start going full throttle when we get enough resources into the area. So that's very positive. We're also looking at trying to get our clinical mental health services being a lot more suicide focused and friendly and actually engage people better, but also actually improving the skill set amongst our clinicians. A lot of the time the training's only just getting going. So, you know, as far as, you know, Australia-wide for clinical services, it tends to have been the old assist, you know, gatekeeper kind of gatekeeper, caregiver type training. So it doesn't quite fit us. So there's a little bit, some improvements across Australia with that at the moment. And we're looking at trying to match up with what we're doing across Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia. But it's a bit of a process that we've kind of, I say to people, we're really just coming out of the primordial swamp and addressing suicide prevention. We're really, really only just getting started because the research is not brilliant, and it's not brilliant around guys yet either. I think that's really all I've got at the moment, Glenn.
That's good. That's a good grounding. Just one question though. You say we don't really know. We haven't really got the research, particularly around guys, but you know we've got experience. We've got what do we call it? We call it not evidence-based, evidence-informed, right?
Yeah,
so
that's
from your, yeah. So from your experience, what are the key things that work with blokes that we should be doing more of?
Certainly it's getting to where men are, and it has to be a whole of service or whole of community kind of approach. But what we need to be able to try and do is package up what we know from research and knowledge from what we experience from coroners to try and funnel it in so that when anybody is talking to a male in a particular stressful situation, has the best knowledge that we can possibly get them to that point. And really that's part of it still building. But I think, look, the key thing is just talking with people. It's just being engaging. It's just doing the simple things is really, really the most effective thing of all. Got it.
Yeah. Talking with people, which was where we started with John, right? Which is going out and having conversations and starting those conversations however you can, meeting men where they are, and then knowing what to do when the conversation turns more serious. I think there's a meeting. I feel there's one of the things we've been talking about this like solidly since last Tuesday, because we had a round table in New South Wales with the Ministry of Mental Health there, and then we've had like events every single day, and there's no shortage of fantastic initiatives in this space, from the primary health networks that we spoke with on Tuesday to sort of the larger men's organisations like Movember and Mates in Construction, to the policymakers, like yesterday we were talking with Suicide Prevention Australia and Queensland Mental Health Commission and the National Mental Health Commission, which is doing all the work with Christine Morgan, the PM Suicide Prevention Advisor. And then on Saturday, we've got what we're calling the Men's Mental Health Movement, which is bringing together loads of different grassroots blokes-led organisations, peer support organisations that are doing great work to connect with the men in their community. And it feels like I sometimes reflect on when I first set off around Australia talking about suicide a few years ago, which was when I met a few of the people in the room today for the first time, when I came to Tassie and Melbourne and over to Perth and so on. And my belief back 3 or 4 years ago was that I needed to go out and have that conversation and convince people to care about male suicide, because people didn't care about male suicide. And I was wrong, because I'm sure there's a couple of people who don't, but I just kept meeting more and more people who care passionately about male suicide, because, these men who are dying, their brothers and their dads and their sons and their uncles and their mates and their work colleagues and all of that. Every single one of them is connected to some wider family or community or network, no matter how loosely. And people do care deeply about this issue, but people don't always know what to do. And actually, whether it's just having a really effective "Are you okay?" conversation, or whether it's being inside, an ongoing therapeutic relationship with someone that lasts, weeks, months, and maybe even years, it's still talking, right? It's still having a conversation. And yeah, and it's interesting, I'm seeing John Clark's face, because I know he's popping up next as we speak. And I know he'll talk about, I'm sure I don't want to preempt what you're going to say, John, I'm sure, but he might reference, the value of medical intervention and stuff like that, all of which is important. But it's ultimately just about talking. And I think sometimes there's a disconnect between the system that's doing suicide prevention and often doing really great work at the point of contact, and then the community we're trying to reach. And also, not just the community we're trying to reach, those individual suicidal men, but the communities are actually now working really hard to try and prevent suicide. There's a real passion out there amongst men in particular to do something, to get involved, to help. And somehow we've got to really embrace that. And I think sometimes we become a little bit sort of hands off about that. We don't kind of want people doing too much of that because they're not medically qualified. They don't use the right language. They haven't been taught how to speak about suicide in a safe way. They use language to describe suicide that we're not comfortable with, but actually is often the language that everyday blokes talk about suicide. So yeah, ultimately it's just talking, right? But there's a lot of skill behind that talking, because we can all bloody talk. But there's a lot of skill behind that talking. And that skill isn't just being a mental health professional. That skill is also being a bloke who can relate to blokes. And we've somehow we've got to learn to marry the two. So thanks for being here, Owen. I'm going to switch straight. Have I got you next, John? Yeah, I'm going to go straight to John Clark, who's another wonderful man I met traveling around Australia when I went down to Tassie. He brings lived experience to the space, but I didn't mean to do this, but it's perfect because you are the mental health professional who brings lived experience to this space. Go on, you've got the floor, 10 minutes, it's all yours.
Fantastic, thanks Glenn. This is a little bit of a shotgun approach, so I'm just going to spray stuff everywhere basically, because I've only got 10 minutes and I'm really passionate about suicide prevention with rural blokes. I am a rural bloke. I grew up in Yea, Victoria, so nice to see a few other Victorians in the room today. Yea's got a population of about, 1,100. It might be 1,200 now. I was born in the same hospital as my dad, so that gives you a bit of an idea of what Yea's like. And nice to see John Patterson as well. We actually lived right next to the Masonic Lodge in Yea, and Dad was the organist. And he used to go over there and practice, and it was a bit of a treat for us kids because we used to sneak in with him, and there was bottles of fizzy pop in there. We used to get a bottle of fizzy pop if we were good. And Dad's a farmer, and he's still farming in Mortlake, Victoria, sheep and cattle farmer. So that's where I feel most at home, is on the land. As a rural suicide prevention worker, I work for Rural Alive and Well. We're a state-based organisation here in Tassie. We've got about a dozen workers, and we cover the entire state of Tasmania. And we work specifically with rural people, a lot of the time working with farmers. And I do a little bit of industry stuff as well. So I do a little bit of stuff in the mining industry. So you can't get sort of more strong, stoic and silent than Tasmanian miners, especially the ones that live down the west coast where they only get a dozen days of sunshine a year. It's probably raining there right now. I got a phone call from my brother the other day. He said, hey, you might want to give Dad a call. He's been in the cattle yards and he's gotten a bit banged up. He's got a bloodshot eye. So I jump on the blower and I said, Dad, I heard you got a bloodshot eye. And he said, oh, no, she's right. She's right. He's downplaying it, of course. And I said, what happened? And he said, well, I was drenching the cattle and I'd open up the crush gate, let a cow out, and one of the weaners barreled straight through, smashed into the gate swung back, hit me in the side of the head. And I said, I put my workplace health and safety hat on and I said, Dad, what do you reckon we could do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because I'm thinking of the other workers as well. Like, he might not care about his own health, but maybe the health of his workers might prevent a workers' comp claim. And Dad says, oh, well, probably just not stand there again. So you get a bit of an idea. We all know, I'm preaching to the converted here. Rural blokes are pretty tough and also downplay health issues and aren't that great at getting help with their health issues. Dad's sort of one of those generations of blokes that never talked about his emotions, never talked about his feelings. He's still pretty awkward if you try and get him to talk about his feelings. He sort of shuts that down pretty quickly. And I like to give him a bit of a hug as well, more just to annoy him, I think, than anything else. because he goes really stiff and he just doesn't know what to do with his arms. I mean, it's just hopeless. But the problem for me, I suppose, is that the apple didn't really fall far from the tree. And when I turned 40, I was contemplating my own death. Actually, I went to one of Glenn's seminars when he came down to Tassie, and it actually encapsulated exactly what I was going through. And I hadn't seen anyone ever put it quite so neatly. But Glenn's model, if you look at the stop male suicide model, he talks about the problem that men get into. And the issue is it sort of goes fixing, coping, solving. And I've done the fixing. I tried everything I possibly could to fix the problems that I faced, and I couldn't fix it. I tried coping as best I could with the emotional pain that I was experiencing, and I couldn't cope any longer. So when men can't fix it, and when they can't cope anymore, they look for the only solution that remains, and that's to take their own life. And understanding that model helps you understand how to prevent it. Because we can help men at both ends, at the fixing end, as has already been mentioned with Owen, you know, talking about actually solving some of those issues. And we can also help them at the coping end as well. So with some coping skills, emotional skills, and that requires men learning new skills, but we can do that, right? So I just want to talk about a couple of things from a lived experience lens, I suppose, and offer that sort of perspective. So we're talking about strong and stoic and silent, and really in that we're talking about traditional masculinity, and that has a lot of disadvantages. In fact, the closer that a man aligns himself with traditional male norms, the worse his health is, and mental health is in almost every aspect. Certainly when it comes to drug and alcohol use, when it comes to risk-taking behaviour, when it comes to mental health, the closer he aligns himself with those masculine gender norms, the worse off he is. Some of those issues we struggle with, and we all know this, it's stigma. The interesting thing for me was that I didn't have anyone stigmatise me when I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. I stigmatised myself. I could not believe that an intelligent person, a young person, married, 3 beautiful kids, wonderful wife, owned my own home, had great career prospects, suddenly I got depression and anxiety. How could that be? I thought that only happened to unfortunate people, homeless people, people with trauma, people with chronic health issues, you know, other people, not average, general sort of, you know, run-of-the-mill people like me. So self-stigma is really powerful. And one of the things that produces is shame. I was just actually listening to Professor Jane Purkis, who worked on the project Man Up that screened on the ABC a couple of years ago. And she was asked, what's one message that you'd like to get across to men? And this was at the Australian Suicide Prevention Conference. She said, I'd like to say there's no shame in getting help. And we'd probably all like to say the same thing as well. And what we mean by that is we're not shaming anyone that gets help, and we don't look down at anyone that gets help. But the reality is there's a whole ton of shame. There's a bucket load of shame when it comes to getting help. And that was one of the things that stopped me from getting help, was that I just felt so ashamed and so weak, and such a miserable excuse for a human being, that when my wife said, I want to have a 40th birthday party for you, I said, under no circumstances will you invite anyone around here, because I'm just a waste of space and I don't want anyone seeing me like this. And so shame is real. So we need to think about that. And in our suicide prevention and in working with men who are suicidal, is to somehow address that and work around that. There's also, as I've already previously touched on, a huge lack of emotional literacy with males, lack of awareness of their own emotions, lack of emotional skills. So when we're feeling intense pain, often that manifests as anger. So we often hear these talks about angry men, and what are we going to do about angry and violent men? I was angry, and even to the point of, I guess, being abusive, and I was downright scary to my family. But underneath, there was a whole world of hurt and a whole world of pain. It's just I didn't know it because I didn't have enough emotional literacy. This is particularly true of all males, but even more so true of rural males. So we need to think about that, and we need to address that as well. As I've mentioned with my dad, poorer help-seeking behaviour. I was working on our farm. We had a farm in New Zealand for a while, and it was genuinely foot rot flats. We actually never got rid of the foot rot in that property. So we sold it in the end. It was just horrendous. I used to go around with a front end loader and pick up the dead ones every week. Anyway, I was vaccinating the rams. So we were vaccinating against foot rot. It was pretty expensive to do, but we vaccinated the rams because they were pretty high value merino rams. And I'm in there and I've got the rams up the race and, you know, silly merino rams, they were hopping about. And one of them reared up just as I went to push the needle into its skin around its neck, and I jabbed myself with foot rot vaccine. It hurt a little bit, so I read the back of the packet. You know how we always read the instructions when something goes wrong? So I'm reading the back of the packet and it said, if this is administered or self-administered or something, seek immediate medical help. So I look around there, I've got half the rams done, the other half are just standing there in the yards, and I look around, there's no water trough in the yards, it's a hot day. Yes, New Zealand have them. And I thought, I'm not going to let these rams out into the paddock to get onto water and have to muster them again. I'll vaccinate the rest of them, and if I haven't keeled over then or I'm not feeling too woozy, then I'll probably be right and I won't have to go to the doctor. Well, I didn't end up going to the doctor, and my finger that I'd vaccinated, it was sore for probably about a month. But the good news is I'll never get foot rot either. So we are very poor at help seeking. I'm a amateur knife maker, and I'm on a couple of the knife maker forums, and one of the guys, he'd actually cut part of his thumb off in the last week and had a picture of it on Facebook. And these guys are notorious for using, apparently electrical tape is good if you cut yourself, and also super glue is another thing that gets mentioned a fair bit. So you can see the extent that we go to not get help. Getting help is seen as weak, and it's seen as feminine. So we need to somehow work within these constructs. So just on rurality, when I grew up, we used to call town people or city people, we used to call them townies. So I don't know, has anyone else heard that expression, townies? And townies were generally viewed as different people, as other people, as people who were different to us. And so rural people have a general lack of distrust, I guess, or a skepticism around town people or city people. They're just not us. They're just not like us. And when you talk about experts, so that takes things to a whole nother level. So if you've got an expert in a city in mental health maybe, and we're suggesting to a rural person to access that, well, experts are just trips under pressure. And what would they know? What would they know about rural life and the pressures that I face and the kind of lifestyle I lead and how I think and what it's like for me to have a mental illness? So we've got that lack of trust, and if you are a townie, and it doesn't mean you're ineffective, it just means that you need to be able to accommodate that and understand that that's how people think or may think. The remoteness of being in rural areas is also an issue, because in being remote, it means you have to be fiercely independent because there is no help available. So come summertime, Dad's got the firefighting unit on the back of the Land Cruiser, and it's full of water and it's ready to go because you've got to fight your own fires, because how long is it going to take the fire department to get there? They may not. So remoteness means we're fiercely independent. We don't want help. Nobody can help. We stand on our own 2 feet. In terms of culture, it can be a little bit infuriating, but rural Australians and rural men have their own culture. It's a distinct culture. It used to frustrate me no end when I was working on the farm, and someone would come onto the farm and Dad would have a yarn with some bloke over a fence post, and they'd just go on and on forever. And I'm thinking, why don't we just get on with it? We need to draft this mob of ewes or mob of lambs, and we just need to get on with it. And they're just having a yaffle, having a yarn, and but that's part of the culture. They even shake hands differently. Watch country people shake hands, and they shake hands from about 2 meters away, and they stretch forward to each other. I mean, physical distancing, they've got it down pat.
1 minute, John.
All right, so 1 minute. Here are some solutions. We need to work cross-culturally. So if we're going to have people working with rural males, they need to have rural orientation. They need to have rural training. They need to know how to speak to rural people and how to behave around rural people. We think about cross-cultural training with people from other cultures. Well, rural males are from other cultures. We need to engage on their turf. Owen already mentioned that. Face-to-face is fantastic, but going out to them is even better. We need to build rapid trust and rapport. I think generally country people want to know if you're genuine. So we can't be faffing about and fluffing about. We need to be really down to earth. We need to build rapid trust and rapport before they write us off. We need to utilise respected people. In every community, there are respected people. If we can get them on board with suicide prevention and they're a respected person, that's going to work. We need to utilise lived experience. Great to see that there's another gentleman in here with lived experience, but whenever I tell my story, I always get people coming up to me and saying, you just described my story, I need to get some help. So using lived experience is a real key. It's really powerful, it's really effective. And lastly, we need to work within the traditional masculine construct. So all of our services need to be male friendly. Put a lens over your service and ask yourself, is it a male friendly service? Or do they have to come into a waiting room and there's still life pictures of flowers on the walls? And in terms of language, you know, I don't tell men to get help. I tell men to sort it out. I tell men that you might feel weak and you might feel ashamed getting this sorted out, but it takes a whole lot of courage to sort it out. In fact, it takes a whole lot more courage to live than it does to kill yourself. So we need to talk about solutions, actions. What are the next steps from today? What are the skills that you need? What are the strategies you need? So avoid using emasculating language and work within that masculine's construct. And finally, all men, we want competence. So if we think about giving a man, supporting a male to find competence in dealing with, fixing and coping with the situation at hand, then he's going to be stronger for the rest of his life.
Beautiful. That's great work, John. You crammed so much in there.
I told you I was excited.
Yeah, you are. It's great. I love the excitement. And the one thing I learned is that I bet you've never had foot rot, have you?
No, it's been fantastic. I've had tinea a couple of times, but not foot rot. Athlete's foot. We have athlete's foot. Yeah. Because I'm an athlete.
Yeah, you are, absolutely. I've seen you posted on the old Facebook there about your latest athletic accomplishment. You put me to shame. Anyway, there's some really great learnings there. I mean, the very first one is just the value of having, however it comes, is the lived experience voice, but the lived experience of men. And I talk a lot about lived experience, particularly at the moment. I'm sitting on the expert advisory group to Christine Morgan, and like you get your 5 minutes every 3 or 4 months. So you have to really focus in on what you want. So I've put my focus on 3 areas, and one of them is the importance of men's voices and men's stories. And that's just a broad point about men's stories, but then it becomes men's stories from lots of different backgrounds, right? And it's really interesting how, you know, when you went through your list, see, if I went through my list, I'd start with gender. I'd start with, you know, they've got to be male friendly. And of course I would, because that's what my job is, right? And we've got that in the National Men's Health Strategy, that health services should be male friendly. They should work out what men's needs and preferences are. And then underneath that, we have priority populations. I sometimes call them the bullet points, because really the Men's Health Strategy doesn't really tell you what to do with the bullet points. It just kind of goes, oh, there's these 9 populations of men that you should do something for, and one of them is rural and remote. And then our thinking stops there. So we go, oh, men, oh yeah, and then rural men. And what you did was you went rurality first. You went our culture first. And then within that, there's the masculinity piece. And you just flipped the thinking on its head. And that's really, really important for us to get. And I learned something today. And I knew about the handshake, which obviously we know we can't do at the moment. But in the comment box, if you go back and have a look, I've also discovered that not only do rural blokes shake hands differently, they roll their sleeves up differently. It says so in here. It must be true. So yeah, that putting so that's really sort of shifted my thinking today, right? This was like a conversation about men who are rural, but it's not. It's a conversation about rural men. It's the other way around, and that's what's really important. So I'm gonna, and even though I live kind of rural, I'm a town bloke. I can't, you know, I'm not a rural Aussie bloke, am I? I'm a pom from a city. So
yeah, but yeah, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that you're going to be ineffective. I think if you keep in mind that they're different, you'll develop the skills to accommodate that. So absolutely, we need everyone. We need all hands on deck, city guys and country guys, to prevent male rural suicide. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. So having heard from John and Owen and John again, two Johns, we're now going to move to actual program. So we've got the team from RAMHP and a particular program that just popped up quite recently, but I'm sure a lot of work has gone into it in the background. We're going to find out about the You Got This Mate program from the RAMHP team. Really looking forward to hearing about this. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I think you have to show us your sleeves first, Glenn.
No, definitely. Look at these.
Not even rolled up.
And I am wearing shorts.
Oh.
Oh, I think it's just frozen.
Beneath my waist down, so that's, yeah. Are you doing a presentation, or are you talking? You got a
We'll
slide?
just talk. I think, yeah.
All good.
Forgive us, we're not wearing shorts because we are based in Orange and it is freezing here. Claire has a cough. It is just related to the cold and nothing else.
Just the cold conference room that we're distancing in. So I guess what we are talking about, the You Got This Mate program, links in really well with everything we've heard up until this point today. And especially John's talk just then about looking at rural people and then males as a cohort of that, which is essentially what we've done when we've developed You Got This Mate. So some background from our perspective, the RAMHP is the Rural Adversity Mental Health Program. We have 20 coordinators based in rural and remote regions across New South Wales, some of whom are on this call. I've seen a couple pop up there. So we have our coordinators who work to link people to care directly with really local knowledge of what's available in that area, knowledge of, on the ground, what the issues are in that area, who they're talking to. So they're a really absolutely invaluable resource to link rural people to the support that's available for them locally. We also, they provide training and just generally inform, our program informs on mental health and wellbeing in rural areas. So what we do, I guess, as the support team, the project team who work out of Orange at the Centre for Rural and Remote Mental Health, is help to develop a lot of those strategies and resources for our coordinators to use on the ground. So to that end, I guess last year we decided to focus on the need that we'd identified previously for RAMHP to better target rural males. So we reach rural communities generally and rural people really well. The local approach works very well in having people, giving someone a real person to speak to who really understands them and their background. But we weren't reaching men as effectively as we were women or women on behalf of men. So that showed up in our evaluation stats, and I think it's just generally an issue anyway with overall, when you look at the research and things like that, that men aren't engaging with services of any type as much as women. So I guess in identifying that need and thinking about how we could target our approach, the first step was to look at why that is. And I think why it is that we weren't reaching men as effectively. I think the reasons for that are very broad and they go well beyond just our program, as I mentioned. But I think I have lots of, we looked at the research and I have lots of personal, anecdotal sort of understanding as to why that is. But I think what we had to do was, I guess, look in a narrower space as to what we can actually do to address these gaps as the Rural Adversity Mental Health Program. Obviously, we can still advocate for systemic and societal change where we can and try to change the conversation, but we really needed to look at practically what can we do. So we looked at the research, and that obviously tells us that men are looking for immediate, direct, concrete and practical sorts of assistance, that they want non-judgmental supports, other men to relate to with similar experiences, and I think that's something that we've heard a lot of today as well. We looked at the manifestations of common mental health problems in men and rural men where we could find that research, and what attitudes we needed to address and appropriate language. So that doesn't mean just looking at, say, mind frame guidelines, but as in what is the language that men are using to describe how they're feeling when they're unwell. And I think that was a really important distinction for us to make when we were developing a resource to talk to rural men. We need to try to speak the same language and obviously keep it appropriate. So there's an intention that can be challenging, but it's, yeah, we looked at definitely that was part of the thought process. So we also had a look obviously at what other supports are available out there. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we did see a need for further support than what's just available, that the all men sort of, I guess, cohort. So there are quite a few men's mental health websites and things like that, and there are quite a few things directed at farmers and that sort of thing, but I think understanding that rural men aren't, or men at all, aren't a homogenous group, and I think the understanding that rural being pretty much anywhere outside of the city, which is where we're based, regional, rural, remote, there is such a broad variation in what that really means. So, and what people's needs are in those different regions. So I think another thing that we did try to look at was obviously the name of this session, the strong, stoic and silent. And the fact that that's not necessarily helpful, that the stereotypes don't necessarily, I guess, sometimes in trying to address those, we can reinforce them, which can actually make that divide greater rather than bridging that gap. So that was a really key part of what we looked at as well. So I guess with all of that information, we decided to develop a website to link rural men to relevant existing supports and provide practical advice beyond eat well, sleep more, drink less, just that next step. What does that mean? How can I actually do that? So yeah, the linking to support as well, we really take as, I guess, a key objective of this website. So we have kept quite distinct and useful sorts of supports that we link through to. We don't have everything on there. There's some brilliant ones out there that we probably haven't included, but we really wanted to keep that simple and direct, and also really highlight the RAMHP service and the fact that you can pick up the phone and speak to one of our coordinators directly, and they will really be able to narrow down what's useful for you and what's available for you in your local area, and yeah, what's going to work for your situation. So I guess during the development, we really focused on reframing the perceptions of vulnerability and help seeking as strength. So rather than seeking help as being weakness or showing vulnerability as being a weakness, we really wanted to flip that and show that that help seeking is actually an act of strength and courage, and that was really a key part of the way that we've written and developed the website. So I guess one of the biggest parts of our website development was our Rural Men's Advisory Group. So we decided to get them together to give us some really practical advice as to what the research and what all of our understanding of what this should look like, what it means in reality. So how do real rural men see, you know, this research in practice? How does it translate into reality? So we put together a group of about 10 different rural men from different walks of life. We had a look at and spoke with our researchers too about some of the key demographics and people with various backgrounds that we really should get on that group to make sure that we're really meeting the mark and hearing everyone's voices. So we had different age groups, different walks of life, different professions and backgrounds on that group. Obviously we can't have everybody, we've only got 10 people, but it was absolutely invaluable at really cementing our thinking. So we have all our key points and you know, we can sit here and think we know what people need, but we really do need that feedback from real people as to what that means for them. They met monthly for 6 months and they provided feedback, suggestions, real life experience and examples of how they would use the platform and how it worked for them. That group was absolutely brilliant, and getting them together, we had our own perceptions of what that was going to be like, and we thought it was going to be quite difficult, if I'm being honest, to actually get everyone talking and really to extract that information. But we had the absolute opposite experience. These men were so willing to share.
We had to stop them talking. I think it's worth noting that RAMHP does have men on the team. However, they are coordinators out in the field. So on the program management team as such, we are all women. So that makes it even more important that we do consult with men. So the men that we did speak with, there was a GP, there was a farmer, there were miners, there was an agronomist, there was a guy from the Department of Primary Industries, and they ranged from early 20s through to late 60s. So it was quite broad, I think you'd agree, the people that we consulted with. And you can probably see this is the room we did it in behind us, which is quite sterile. So we thought it was not going to go well because we also sort of bought into the idea that men don't want to talk. So when they came in and understood that it was a safe space, we gave them biscuits and tea, and that's as far as the budget extends. They would not stop talking. And the information we gleaned was quite surprising. So from a design point of view, which is more my area as the comms coordinator, I thought that men didn't really like colours, but apparently they're sick of seeing the same two colours being black and yellow or red and black. They want to see something that is colourful. They want to see something that is positive and reframes mental health and the journey from mental illness to wellness as being a positive one. And I think that John and Owen have just reinforced what we found there in what you all spoke about. So it's quite lovely to have our findings reinforced by blokes that are actually on the ground. So we also focused quite closely on the language that we used on the website. So men, from what we found, they like it to be kept simple. It needs to be action focused. It needs to give practical tips. It needs to be realistic for a start. and it needs to give men an idea about how they can actually incorporate it into their day-to-day life. So aspects of the website focus on the general stuff like sleep and food and exercise and all that sort of stuff. But we're also quite realistic. We address alcohol and other drugs and tobacco. We don't advocate for abstinence. We advocate for reducing of use. So we do try and keep it realistic. Also, another note from our consultation with the men is that a lot of them felt the point at which they sought help was when they realized how much it impacted on those around them. So one of the guys said he felt angry all the time, and he had 2 small children, which is hard for anyone, but it was only the point at which his wife said, "Do you realize how you're making our children feel?" that he sought some help. So we try to bring it back to the personal experience as well. On You Got This, Mate, there's also tips for people who are concerned about a man in their life. So a little guide on how to have those conversations and where to take it from there. And there's also some great lived experience videos from men from different walks of life talking about their journey to wellness. So we officially launched on the 30th of April. So that's a bit over 5 weeks ago. The website has already had 2,500 unique viewers, 6,500 page views, over 700 video views. Our Facebook promotion has reached over 25,000 people. We've had 7 ABC interviews, 3 radio interviews, numerous newspaper articles, and that's all without any sort of budget to push it out there. So people are super keen, and men in particular, to have this information. It just needs to be, I think, delivered in a format that is attractive and speaks to them for their situation. So
great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. It's really, so I didn't give you a warning, but I think it's come to a good spot to jump in there, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I was chatting to someone in the background and didn't give you a warning. It's really great to hear, two things. One, the research process where you picked up on the stuff that we've been talking about in the men's health sector for 10, 20 years, reinforcing what does work for men rather than the focus on, how can we get men to access existing services. And whilst the research isn't, this is not the suicide prevention piece, this is just the engaging with men piece. The knowledge out there about engaging with men is really well established, and you kind of listed it all off, right? Practical, solution focused, non-judgmental, uses language blokes understand, gives actual practical solutions of stuff they can actually do, that type of stuff. And then that focusing on the fact that you actually then worked. It's amazing how often this doesn't happen. It's not the norm. You actually work with the people you were trying to engage, and you actually ask them. It's like, and it's what we would do if we were trying to sell sugary drinks or beer or stuff to people. The corporates would do that. They'd go and find out what works to sell aftershave and beer and cars to men. And yet we don't do a great job of doing that when it comes to mental health interventions. And it's not just men in general. It's kind of like the community of men that you were trying to engage with. And it's not the first time I've heard people going through that experience and then being surprised that, oh, actually there's that fear of, well, if we do that, will they want to talk? Will they come?
Yeah.
But actually you create the right situation, which in one level is as simple as tea and biscuits.
Yeah.
So I sat on a community advisory group for some research on suicide prevention in older men. We went through the same process of engaging men over 80 to have conversations, and the researchers were like, will they want to talk? And we said, yeah, just ask them straight. Tell them what the task. Men are very, to be stereotypical, men are very task orientated. If you tell them what the task is, they'll do it. If the task is sit down, eat biscuits, tell us what you think about suicide, they'll do it. Because it's kind of like, okay, that's the job, that's the game, those are the rules, then we'll do it. And often we overcomplicate it.
Yeah,
but that's
absolutely.
fantastic that you went through that kind of that Rural Men's Advisory Group process over a period of time as well, not just like a quick sort of like 1 hour sort of focus group. You really engaged with them by the sounds of it and got, yeah, fantastic.
Yeah,
So,
we've had continued engagement with them as well. So it's lovely to see that they really are committed to helping us improve men's mental health in a rural space.
yeah. So while we've still got them, I'd like to hear about one by one from each of the other speakers, even just some reflections on, you know, what you heard in this last talk, which really resonated, or just some reflections on the overall session, which is we're asking. I think we've agreed that strong, silent, and stoic doesn't do justice to explaining rural men. It's more complicated than that, and I think, as John quite rightly said, sometimes they are, and sometimes they need to be, and sometimes that's okay. And actually, but then there are times when that's not helpful, and we've got lots of examples of how rural men don't necessarily follow that stereotype and can engage and all the rest of it. So does suicide prevention work for men? That's the sort of the broader question, but also just any reflections that you have on the talk you've just heard. And I'll go back around the way we'll go back around the way we started. So John Patterson.
Thanks, Glenn. I think rural men basically are, they work in an isolated environment. So I think to get them talking is the hardest part. I don't think there's any problem once they are talking, but it's to actually break that ice to get them to let go, so to speak. Basically, most rural men, in my experience, and I'm the local captain of the fire brigade, it's the same system. You know, we've got although we've got men and women in the fire brigade, it's the same thing. Rural people, basically, they stand further away from each other. You talk about shaking hands. Yes, you shake hands with 1 metre or 2 metres apart. And that's basically their whole demeanour. They're actually very aware of where they are and what they can and can't do. And part of that is the way in which they interact with other people. If they don't know you very well, they're not going to talk or open up. So I think, and that's one of the things about pros, it just gives them the ability to say, I like that. I can identify with part of that, and that's probably a way to get them engaged in the conversation. We've started an area, a thing in the Mortlake, Warrnambool area called Let's Talk, started by a guy called Craig Wood, and that's the same sort of thing. We put, as Freemasons, I think we put about 150 grand into that as well, to try and sort of boost that along. And the idea of that is exactly what we're talking about. It's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about how we actually engage, and actually it's not about solving the problem, it's actually pushing them into or helping them identify where they need to go next. One of the problems I do have though is that people say to me, oh look, I've given such and such a telephone number and expect him to ring. Those things I don't think work. I don't think that works at all. We've actually got to, when people confide in you, I think you've actually got to take the lead and help them. I'm not saying solve the problem, but actually take the next step by getting someone to try and help them engage with them in some way, because they're not going to, they've got the telephone number, but they're going to look at that. Are they going to ring it? And I think John Clark sort of mentioned that as well. It's a big hurdle for them to take. But once you actually take that hurdle, I think you're on the way. So let me say at this point, well done, and thank you for today.
Great, thank you, John, and thanks for being here. Really appreciated your contribution and the great start you got us off to. Owen, some thoughts from you as we come towards the end.
Yeah, it's been great listening to everyone. One of the things that I've found that's really interesting, I had a gentleman come in a couple of years ago who was really distressed, had a pair of sunglasses on, wouldn't look at me, and I could see the tears trickling out from underneath it. And he grunted at me with monosyllables for a while, and basically he turned up and he had been having suicidal thoughts, but he wanted nothing to do with us, and he was off. I said, look, you know, that's not a problem. I'll give you a call later in the week. No, don't worry about it. I don't want to talk to you. So one of the things that I've found with him, but also found with a lot of other guys, is that persistence in, no, look, I'll give you a call. And that phone call that I never saw him again physically. I think I rang him for about 4 to 5 weeks. and which time he improved. But it was just a simple phone call, for a conversation. Hi, what are you up to? And there was nothing clinical. There was nothing heavy in there. It was just somebody to talk to. So he could have brushed me off any number of times, but I guess the thing that came out of that example was that just that persistence and just that extra phone call. I was thinking about you earlier. How are you going with such and such, or how did you get on with such and such? So just that real, just gentle connectedness. You engage guys, you get a chance to help. I think, use the term coached I saw before, just coach them through what's going on.
That's great, Owen. Thanks for being here. I always learn an extra layer of stuff each time I have a conversation with you. Last but not least, John Clark.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I just thought I'd touch on some of the comments, actually. Angeline Craig mentioned that they talk about shame attenuation. So this is the idea of actually mentioning the shame. It's the elephant in the room. And I think if she talks about normalising those feelings and acknowledging them. And look, this, getting this sorted out might make you feel weak. It might make you feel ashamed. But you know what? It takes a lot of courage to do this. So I like that idea of normalising those feelings. Peter Gorman's also been vaccinated. He rang the vet instead of the doctor. That's a good idea. I probably should have rung the vet. Don't like going to the doctor, but the vet's not so bad. Karen McCall said, if someone had asked you if you were having thoughts of suicide, would you have found that helpful? Absolutely, because I didn't know who I could talk to. I didn't even know how to talk about suicide. It's something that I thought a lot about, just couldn't articulate it. Being able to talk about it is really powerful because it kind of takes a lot of sting out of it, takes a lot of heat out of it, takes a lot of energy out of those powerful thoughts. So absolutely, we need to talk to people about it and be comfortable talking about it, even though it makes us uncomfortable. Suzanne said, you mentioned help as being seen as weak. Is there a way of engaging men in helping others? And sorry, the other speakers, was it Claire mentioned this, that help seeking, we need to help men understand that help seeking is actually a skill, and it's not something you inherit. It's not something that's ever taught to you as kids, and it is a skill that needs to be learned, and it's a skill that we can learn. Suzanne asked if there was, she talked about humour, and there was a bit of discussion about humour as well. Humour, absolutely. A lot of people mentioned that humour was quite dry in the country, and there were some examples of that as well. I had a shearer ring our helpline, and he wouldn't tell me his name, wouldn't tell me where he was, so we couldn't follow him up. And I said, look, how do you plan to kill yourself? And he said, I'm going to hang myself. And I said, geez, mate, that's pretty full on. I said, you don't want to cock it up because you'll be sucking soup out of a straw in a nursing home for the rest of your life. And he laughed and said, mate, you guys are all right. I'll give you my name and number. You can ring me. So he actually agreed to have a worker come and see him. I didn't say that in the first 5 minutes, of course. There was quite a lot of conversation in lead up to that. John Patterson mentioned that there's a program called Let's Talk in Victoria near Mortlake, run by Nurat Vet. And I think that's a great idea because vets are those respected people in communities. So having a vet run it, interestingly, vets have, I think, 4 times the suicide rate of the general population, if I'm not mistaken. So they're probably well equipped to run suicide prevention plans. So just a few comments and responses to stuff in the chat box.
That's great. Really well swept up there, John. I'm just going to bounce off the humour piece, and because it's a regular theme of work with men, that people who work with men really effectively often use humour in a really skillful way. And it's not that kind of like, it goes beyond that sort of jokey banter, which is a good way of engaging in the first instance, but actually goes deeper than that, because it, rather like, John's poetry, humour can open up a space between two people that provides for connection. In our report coming out, guide coming out next Friday on how to develop male-friendly services, we talk about the use of humour as a common factor, and we'll be looking a little bit more at that coming up. I wonder if Mark McConville's in the room, because there's a guy called Mark McConville who actually, he runs a thing called the Laughter Clinic. He actually focuses on, in a very academic way, but actually very good, because he's a comedian by background who became an academic. I'll have to see if we can get him on. I thought he'd registered. Now look, we've gone over the hour. You're done. Thank you for all of you. Virtual hand claps. As always, you can stick around a little bit if you like. We're kind of on the the broad sort of lunch break time, but we've been trying to drop in some lunchtime lectures because people want to stick around. So today